The 2025 schedule for the Texas Longhorns was released last week. Is it tough enough for them? We discuss.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by FanDuel. Get into the NFL action with FanDuel. A big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, once again, the Longhorns 2025 football schedule was released last week. We go through each opponent on that schedule, and then over the last two segments of today's show, reacting live, responding live to some of your YouTube comments. I've already responded to them on YouTube, but responded to some of them on the show, some of my favorite ones. Over maybe over 400 comments last week. A lot of engagement last week on Locked On Longhorns. I really appreciate that. The Georgia video with Tony hit 10K. Always appreciative for that as well. So, like I said, a lot of comments. And so I want to, show some love back and respond to those live on the show. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we're talking about the 2025 schedule for the Texas Longhorns this year, and we know Texas and schedule in the same sentence has been such a sensitive topic. Sensitive topic this year, right? I'm trying to say subject and topic at the same time. Some Monday morning. Sensitive topic this year, right? All the talk was about Texas and how they didn't play anybody and, their SEC schedule and how they had the luckiest draw in SEC history. And that's why they lost to Georgia twice and blah, blah, blah. Right now, Texas is in the playoffs, playing Clemson this Saturday with a chance to win the national championship, just like 11 other teams. And you make these schedules so far in advance, not necessarily the SEC schedule, but Texas had the defending champion, Michigan Wolverines, on their schedule in Ann Arbor. You were thinking that is going to be a very tough game. And I still think it was a tough, Texas didn't go in there and just, even though we beat them pretty badly, I still think it was a tough environment to win in, regardless of the level of that Michigan team. But you're not expecting to face Michigan and then they end up being 7-5 and unranked. Oklahoma is one of your toughest games every year. You're not expecting Oklahoma to barely be bowl eligible. Like Texas A&M, you probably were expecting them to be 8-4, right? And they were 8-4, so I can't speak on that one. But nonetheless, right, a large part of the schedule conversation is because the teams on Texas schedule did not hold up their end of the bargain. Now, like I said, we can be self-aware and say that if you look at the top SEC teams and you say that they are, Alabama, Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri, and South Carolina, Texas did only play one of those teams. But what bothers me, and I guess, maybe I need to temper this because we lost both times to Georgia when we played them. But what bothers me is when people assume that if Texas had played those teams, we would lose. Like we would lose to Missouri or we would lose to Ole Miss or we would lose to South Carolina. Maybe we do, but maybe we beat them. And maybe the Texas team that showed up all year that was dominating teams outside of Georgia beats them too, right? So, like I said, maybe the schedule wasn't the toughest, but whether you want to crack jokes or not, Texas is one of the best teams in the country, and hopefully we can prove it this weekend in the playoffs. Now, I think when you look at the Texas 2025 schedule, I think a lot of that conversation that we saw for this year is going to be mute, right? I think when you look at this schedule, even though it's the same SEC teams, I do think that this schedule looks a lot tougher on paper, right? It starts with going to Ohio State, going to the shoe, and I don't imagine that Ohio State will run into the same problems that Michigan did, right? I do not expect this Ohio State team to be 7-5 at the end of the season, okay? And so you're going to be going against a really tough Ohio State team, first game of the season on the road. And I'm actually excited that this is a week one matchup because if you think about it this season, right, The two best week one games were Florida and Miami, which I mean Florida was out of there, and then Notre Dame and Texas A&M. Right, like neither one of those were just marquee matchups. Arch Manning, Texas at Ohio State, two teams that will find themselves in the playoffs next year, two teams that are legitimate national championship contenders probably every year moving forward. It's a real marquee matchup. So it's going to be a tough game. You know what I mean? I don't know how many players or who all is going to be returning for that Ohio State team. You know, Caleb Downs will still be there on the defensive side. Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith, two of the best wide receivers in the country, will still be there on the offensive side. It's going to be a dogfight. It's going to be a really tough game for Texas, and that's not going to be a game like Michigan that can be used against the Longhorns later in the season. And then, you know, it's going to be Arch Manning's turn at that point, right? A lot of people, even Texas Longhorn fans, feel like the ceiling of this football team is higher with Arch Manning, even though it won't be the same roster as 2024. We'll have players moving on to the National Football League. Texas fans will get their wish, right? Against a big opponent, you will have Arch Manning in as your starter, and we'll see how it goes. Second week of the season, first game in DKR, San Jose State. They were 7-5 this year. I mean, even if they were 12-0, this is a team that Texas should be able to handle. Just a big difference in talent level. But it is your first home game of the season, San Jose State. And then after that, you play UTEP, right? It's one of the bottom dwelling programs in college football, period. Like, not just in their division, not just in their conference, but period. They started off 0-6 this year. Now, they did end the season 3-9. Right. And so I guess that's promising. If you start the season 0-6 and then you go 3-3 down the stretch, you know, that's huge momentum going into next season, right? Going into 2025. Nonetheless, they started off 0-6, right? That should be an opportunity for a shutout for Texas. Then we have a bye week. I hate that this bye week is right here. I feel like you're just starting to get excited for the season, right? You played Ohio State. Then you have that big drop off of, okay, now we got San Jose State and now we got UTEP. And obviously, we're excited to see every Texas game, but we know that we're going to probably blow out San Jose State and UTEP. And then you have a week of no Texas football, right? When you feel like the season just started, you know, come on now. So then you play Sam Houston State, who was 9-3 this year. They've always been a fairly good program, bowl eligible this season. You come back at home and then you play them. And then this is when your SEC schedule starts. Now, you are playing the same SEC teams that you played this year, just flip-flopping the locations. So I do think that even though you're playing the same teams, some of the circumstances and the teams will be better. Some of the circumstances surrounding the teams you played this year will be better. Florida's a prime example. You'll probably play DJ Lagway in 2025. You didn't play him this year. I still think we're going to have to deal with some of that. You didn't really play anybody outside of Georgia talk in terms of your SEC schedule, but it should be a little bit more of a test for the Longhorns than it felt like it was this season. So after Sam Houston State, you go to Florida. And like I said, in the swamp, tough environment. DJ Lagway playing. We saw that team looked completely different when he was at quarterback. And this is a team with some talent. They brought in some really good players, especially the last couple of years. And, you know, Billy Napier got that vote of confidence, but you can see that this team plays hard for him, right? They fight hard for him, and that's going to be a tough game in the swamp, no doubt. After that, you come back to Dallas to play Oklahoma, you know, in a game that you can, you know, never take for granted, a game that you can never pencil in. And I expect the Oklahoma Sooners to just put a better product on the field than they did, you know, last year or in 2024, this year, excuse me. Like, that just was an embarrassing product on the field. Not sure if they go back to Michael Hawkins at quarterback. Jackson Arnold is at Auburn now. Nonetheless, I just expect more from Oklahoma. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. All right. Then you go at Kentucky, at Mississippi State. I think you're flipping the locations. You're going to those spots. I think Michael Van Buren and Jeff Lebby might have a better product on the field for Mississippi State. I really don't have a ton of faith in Kentucky, although that backup quarterback that replaced Brock Vandergriff against Texas, he was slinging it a little bit. So, you know, maybe by the time we play Kentucky next year, he'll have something to, you know, show for us. But Kentucky, at Mississippi State, those are not games that, if Texas is playing Texas Longhorns football, should be a concern. Vanderbilt at home, you know, Diego Pavia likely won't be there. I think that Vanderbilt magic rubs off. I think that's going to be an easy game for the Longhorns. Then you have another bye week, and then you get into the meat of your schedule, right? Where this year it was Oklahoma, Georgia, and then Vanderbilt. The meat of your schedule is the last three games, right? So you have a bye week. You get 2 weeks to prepare for Georgia on the road in Athens, which is really good for the Longhorns. I think advantage Longhorns there. Then you have Arkansas and Texas A&M at home, right? Two rivalry games, two games that you can't take for granted again, just like Oklahoma, but you do get those games on your turf in DKR, right? So it does look like a very favorable schedule again for the Longhorns. Obviously, Ohio State's going to be tough at Florida versus Oklahoma, and then Georgia, Arkansas, and Texas A&M. But I think if you can get to that Georgia game either undefeated or with one loss, you're in really good shape to still make the SEC championship game again for the second straight year and obviously pencil yourself into the playoffs. So I like the schedule for 2025. I like the fact that Arch Manning is going to be starting for this schedule. And I think the Texas Longhorns will continue to prove that they're one of the best teams in the country with this schedule next season. A quick word from our sponsors, and then I get into some of your YouTube comments about my comments on we should see more Arch Manning against Clemson. And then, you know, some of the best reactions that were had to the SEC championship game between Texas and Georgia last weekend or a couple weekends ago at this point. All right. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns brought to you by TNT, Locked On NFL and college, the college football playoff. It's that time of the year. The college football playoff is back, and with the newly expanded 12-team format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. TNT sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern, leading into our first matchup, the SMU Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. All right. So, like I said, a lot of engagement last week on Locked On Longhorns. Always grateful for it. Two episodes that we did that produced a lot of engagement were the first episode, which obviously was the reaction to the college football, the SEC championship between Texas and Georgia. Me and Tony's Monday episode, like I said, it did 10K, over 300, maybe over 400 comments. So really good reaction to our reaction to Texas losing to Georgia again. And then my next episode I did, I talked about how Arch Manning, we should see a lot more of him in the playoffs, right? Like how he's just too much of a weapon with his arm and his legs to not see him in the playoffs. I think it would be negligent of Steve Sarkisian to leave Arch Manning on the bench. And I'm not saying that Quinn Ewers should not be the starter, right? But I do think that Arch Manning needs to see 10 to 15 snaps, at least, against Clemson, right? And then against every playoff team, I think that is a viable weapon that we need to use. So those were, two episodes I did last week, and it got a lot of engagement, a lot of reaction. And so I'm going to respond to some of my favorite comments from both of those episodes on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns. So the first one is Manning needs to start against the Tigers. Make the Tigers defend the whole field by playing Manning. I do agree with the second part, right? I think that when you put Arch Manning in, it just changes the philosophy and the numbers of the defense. Is he going to pass the ball? The read option becomes dangerous because it's like, is he going to hand the ball off, right? Is he going to keep it and run? That puts, the edge defender or whoever the defender is that's targeting the read option in conflict. It's just going to be really tough for them to account for what Arch Manning can do. And it's not like he is an athlete playing quarterback. Like he can sling the ball down the field on time with accuracy and drop it in the bucket. So if he's in the game, you just have to defend so much more than you would have to, if you're defending Quinn Ewers. I still think that because Arch has not really started all season outside of the two games that, Quinn missed due to injury, and Quinn has the experience, he is our best bet to win big at the quarterback position. But once again, I do think it would be negligent to keep a weapon, a dual threat, borderline superstar, right? Arch Manning, which I think he'll be on the sidelines when he can come in and provide so much for this Texas offense, a new wrinkle that'll just be so hard for any defense to defend, right? Arch inside the 20, right? Which is the red zone. You know that. You know it. We know it. Kirby Smart knows it. Why not Sark? I think that we've never really seen Sark lean on the quarterback run. He's very, very pro style, with his quarterbacks. even though we throw a lot of screens, right? But he's very and a lot of RPOs. But outside of that, he's very, very like pro style. And we've never really seen him just lean on the quarterback run. He's never really had, that I remember, just a dynamic, running quarterback. Maybe you could say Hudson Card, but I don't think he's had the level of talent, in terms of a runner that he has now with Arch Manning. And so maybe that's why you have to adjust. And I think that's why we've seen him kind of sprinkle Arch Manning in certain packages and run the ball. But I do think, that you made a good point here that it should be more consistent, especially a team that has struggled to score in the red zone really for years now under Steve Sarkisian. And it could, be with Quinn Ewers. I guess we'll find all this out next year when the common denominators change a little bit. But I do think, I said 10 to 15 snaps, and it probably would make the most sense in the red zone, right? When the field condenses, when, scheme is limited, when all those deep routes and all those deep crossers and all the confusion that you try to cause in the secondary is limited, sometimes you just have to line up and be better than your opponent, especially when you get down in the red zone. And I think a big key to that, or an easier way to do that, is to have a dynamic playmaker like that in Arch Manning that causes so much conflict on the defense. So I do think that when we get into the red zone, we need to see more Arch Manning. I felt like we saw it against Texas A&M, and then he dialed it back against Georgia, which would have made more sense to do against Georgia because they play all that man coverage. But it's in the playoffs. You got to pull out every stop. Hopefully, we do see more Arch Manning in the red zone. Hooray, someone besides me thinks Arch is a better choice at quarterback. He should have been starting since day one. Coming into the season, I did wish that Quinn Ewers would have gone to the draft. I was ready to move on to Arch Manning. I felt like we had seen largely the ceiling of Quinn Ewers. I did think he would come back and be better this year. I think he's largely been the same quarterback that he was last season, which is good, but at times not good enough. I don't think that he's the better option at quarterback right now. I just think he's too talented to keep on the bench, and he's too much of a weapon to keep on the bench. I do think eventually his ceiling at Texas will be higher than Quinn Ewers reached. But right now, I do think that Quinn Ewers should be your starter, but Arch Manning is too good to keep on the bench. I hope I'm making that clear because it could probably be confusing. It is malpractice what Sark is doing at quarterback play. Not saying Art should start, but he needs to be more involved in this offense. This is the playoffs. It's about winning football games. I completely agree, right? I wouldn't call it malpractice yet. Sark has had 2 weeks to prepare. We have seen him sprinkle it in a little bit more in the offense the last couple of weeks. Maybe you could say it's malpractice that he didn't use Arch more against Georgia. I certainly would agree on that. I just think Steve Sarkisian is smart enough. I think Steve Sarkisian is smart enough that you're 4 games away from winning the national championship. And we can't take this team for granted. We think Texas will still be super talented and still have a really good defense and, maybe even a better running game in 2025 and still really talented receivers. Yes. And a really good offensive line. But this looks like a championship team right now. Like this looks like a team on the cusp right now. And I think you need to do everything in your power to win the next 4 games and hoist a trophy with this roster, right? Just like last year, you had Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, and Jordan Whittington. And I'm not sure that you have the same level of talent in the wide receiver room right now. So you need to try to get it done with this team. And I think Steve Sarkisian is smart enough to say it's the playoffs. You lose, you go home. I need to get Arch Manning in there to make some plays. Suppose you've all seen Arch Manning's last few high school games when he choked hugely, throwing interceptions against stiff competition in the playoffs. You'll understand why Sark didn't use Arch against Georgia in that case. He is not ready for this yet. Next year is his turn, and I hope we have a solid backup for him. Arch is still more about hype, but I can see his potential. This could be Quinn Ewers' burner. You never know. You never know. Using Arch like Tim Tebow is crazy work. Just start him already if we're trying to win a championship. With Quinn, we might beat Clemson. I mean, yeah, you are kind of using Arch like Tim Tebow. You're just expecting a little bit more throwing of the ball, but with his feet on the ground, not the jump pass. But essentially, I mean, that's what it is, right? Bringing him in like Tim Tebow for that change of pace and making the defense defend just a little bit more. But I think Arch brings a little bit more into the game than Tim Tebow. So we'll see. Well, my question is, why is Quinn the issue when we only rush for 31 yards? The last game we rushed for 30 plus yards. Our offensive line could not get any push. Our wide receivers also had key drops that killed drives. We had penalties, and perhaps the most prominent missed opportunity is we didn't convert on 2 makeable field goals. If we make those field goals, we win. Right. Quinn is not necessarily the problem. If you're talking about the Georgia game, Quinn was not necessarily the problem, but he also was not the solution. And that is my problem with Quinn Ewers, right? When is he going to be the solution? When is he going to step up and lead this team to victory when everything is not perfect around him? So we can look at the box score, even though he threw 2 interceptions and should have thrown a third one, and we can say other people around Quinn weren't perfect. But isn't that when you expect a quarterback like Quinn Ewers to step up and get you a win when it's right there in the balance? So like I said, Quinn may have not been the reason we lost, but he's almost never the reason we win. Sark obviously knows 14 million% more about football than me, but you don't need a PhD in the sport to see that Ewers isn't the guy to win big games. In 3 years as a starter with immense talent surrounding him, he's led the team to only one big win. I'm assuming he's talking about Alabama. Quinn isn't a threat to strike downfield or run. He doesn't allow the offense to stretch the field. It's all very one-dimensional, and he floats balls and makes bad decisions by throwing into disadvantageous coverages. He also looks tentative and not confident on the field. I do not see leadership. When Arch comes in, you can visibly see the team's energy level rise. Yes, he'll make rookie mistakes, but we gain more than we lose. That was my thought coming into the season. Yes, Quinn had the experience, but Arch was talented enough with all the talent around him to learn on the job, and Texas still probably be in the exact same position they are in now. But they're not. And we have to rely on Quinn to win big games, and we have to hope that Quinn and the rest of this roster can win big games. And that's why I said the formula is to run the ball and play defense. Because if you ask Quinn to go out there and win the game for you, Texas will end up at home watching the rest of the playoffs. I believe in Sark, and he's done an incredible job, but I fear he's going to blow this opportunity with the quarterback situation. We're not going to bully teams like Georgia along the offensive line of scrimmage, and therefore will struggle running the ball against honest fronts if we meet again. That means Arch is a +1 runner is the only option to turn to, and I'm not saying ditch Quinn per se. Arch needs an extended package, if not red zone ownership, zone reads, RPOs, design quarterback draws on top of slants and fades in the red zone with Arch. Let him go. I don't care to hear he's not ready. We need him. Couldn't have said it any better, my brother. 10 to 15 plays, utilizing everything that you just said, brings so much to this Texas offense and could be what pushes us over the top to be a national championship team with this 2024 roster. Quick word from our sponsors, and then I get into some more comments on my YouTube channel, more so about the SEC championship between Texas and Georgia. All right, get ready. Ooh, that was a lordy. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5, get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. All right. This comment, I know the frequent refrain has been how good the Georgia front is, and that's why we couldn't run the ball. That's why there was so much pressure on Ewers. Okay, if that is the case, how do teams like Georgia Tech run the ball? Is the Texas offensive line running backs worse than Georgia Tech? I don't get it. Georgia Tech was able to run the ball, but UMass ran for over 200 yards. Obviously, they didn't beat Georgia, but UMass ran for over 200 yards. And we have less than 70 yards combined against Georgia this year in 2 games. When a program like UMass, I'll say it again, had ran for over 200 yards against Georgia, right? So it's not just you can't run against Georgia. You obviously can. Ole Miss did it, right? Georgia Tech did it. UMass did it. Alabama did it. Texas just has to be better. They have to find a way because it's possible. We just haven't been able to do it. Georgia fan here coming in peace. Y'all will not beat us until y'all can block the front 7, period. Not being able to run the ball, giving up 5+ sacks and more than 5 tackles for loss. You won't beat us in 100 tries. It's the O-line. If you lose the line of scrimmage, you can't win here. If y'all would have played Bama or South Carolina or Tennessee, you would know this already. Y'all had the easiest schedule in the conference. Y'all would have multiple losses if y'all played Bama or South Carolina or Tennessee or Ole Miss. Maybe. And maybe those games would have prepared us better to go against a team like Georgia. And certainly the offensive line has to play better than they did in those two matchups to beat a team like Georgia. But once again, all that has led to Texas being the 5 seed in the playoffs and 4 games away from being national champions. It's just the facts. Bruh, he's talking y'all, you and Tony, are hilarious. Our guys at Locked On Bulldogs are funny, but not this funny. Look, there were a ton of comments asking me to replace, Clint and Daniel on Locked On Bulldogs. A bunch of Georgia fans saying that, me and Tony brought energy to the show that Clint and Daniel don't on Locked On Bulldogs. I think they do a great job. I think they're both funny as hell, but I do appreciate the love. Like I said, it was a lot of comments, comparing me to, Clint and Daniel on Locked On Bulldogs favorably. Like I said, I think they do a really good job, but I also think me and Tony do a damn good job as well, especially on that Monday show. We can critique any part of the roster, but let's be real. If yours were anywhere above mediocre, Texas would probably be 13-0 right now. I do think that, as harsh as that sounds, there is some truth to that. And I'm not saying Quinn Ewers is mediocre, right? I'm not saying that. But I do think if Quinn Ewers was the quarterback that we all expected him to be by now, he would have been able to dominate those matchups against Georgia. To me, when you're getting that much one-on-one coverage on the outside with receivers who are getting open, we've seen it like in both games, the receivers are getting open against Georgia, right? It's not like they're locking us down. When you're getting that much one-on-one coverage as a quarterback, if you can't exploit that, that's a big question mark. And I think the fact that Kirby Smart has gone against Texas twice and said, I dare Quinn Ewers to beat me, and we've gotten the result that we've gotten twice, this kind of tells the story right there for you. Or agree with everything on here. Georgia bottled up that run game and pressured Quinn all game into making him make a decision because they know Quinn cannot play off script. Kind of telling if you make the opposing team's elite quarterback beat you. If guys aren't schemed open, Quinn's not throwing it. I also think attention to detail is not there. Pick six, but you don't block anybody. Penalties for damn near 100 yards. I think all of that is true. You know what I mean? The penalties certainly, it shows an undisciplined football team at times, right? I don't think we're undisciplined as a program. Obviously Jalen Gilbo caught a lot of slack. I mean, I'm not going to, rag on Jalen Gilbo, but maybe a block, and maybe more of an effort to make a move from Jahdae Barron, and Texas wins that game. But ultimately, yes, it is an indictment on Quinn Ewers that Kirby Smart is rushing forward, playing man on the outside and saying, you can't beat this consistently. I'm not going to disguise it. I'm not going to try to trick you. I'm just going to play man, and you can't beat it twice. I do think that's an indictment on Quinn Ewers and Steve Sarkisian. Absolutely. Statistically, the Longhorns beat Georgia like a drum in the first half, but you couldn't close the deal. Georgia's been a second-half team all year long. It doesn't even look like Texas was prepared for that. Even with our backup quarterback, we dominated the Longhorns. You had your chances. What I'll say about that is championship teams just find a way to win games like that. And Texas should have found a way to win that game. But Georgia, that championship pedigree, found a way to win it. And so that's what I'll say about that. I do think that Texas dominated the stat sheet, but Georgia just found a way to win. Whether it was the penalties, whether it was missing field goals, not converting touchdowns into field goals, whatever it was, Georgia just found a way to win. Personnel beats Kirby and company, not schemes. Absolutely. In games like that, you just need those game-breaking type players. And we didn't have enough of them against Georgia this year. You were absolutely right, my brother. Texas has a kicking problem and a quarterback problem. This needs to be fixed before we start playing Clemson, because I got news for Longhorn fans. Don't think for once Clemson is going to fall asleep. No, they are coming to Austin ready to eat. Exactly. It's the playoffs. It's Dabo. He's been here before. Texas may be better than Clemson on paper, but do not think for a second that Texas is going to roll into DKR and just beat Clemson because this is an easy matchup. Clemson has every opportunity to win this game. It's going to be very tough for Texas, and they're going to present a lot of problems for the Texas Longhorns football team. So like I said, don't look at that 3 losses on paper. And, I know this isn't the same Clemson team that was dominating, a couple years ago with Trevor Lawrence, but don't think for a second that Clemson is just going to get walked over in DKR on Saturday. Talking about me and Tony, even though, I think this is more about me. I feel like both of these guys can make a living doing toothpaste commercials. Thanks. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Texas and Clemson coverage all week as we set up for Texas' first game in the 12-team college football playoff era. Hook 'em. Peace.